Welcome. I'm Bill Chen, Senior Advisor to the Chinese American Heritage Foundation. The Foundation's mission is to recognize, appreciate, and celebrate historical contributions made to the United States by citizens of Chinese heritage. Today, May 10, 2021, is the 152nd anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad, and our featured speaker is Gordon H. Chang. He co-directed the Stanford University Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project and is the author of the book Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic story of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad. He also co-edited the book The Chinese and the Iron Road, Building the Transcontinental Railroad. Let's welcome Gordon Chang, Senior Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and the Olive H. Palmer Professor of Humanities, Stanford University. Gordon?
Thank you, General Chen. Thank you, Chinese American Heritage Foundation. Thank you all for joining this webinar. I wish we could do it in person. It'd be much more fun to be able to see one another and chat. I've put up on my screen, and I hope everyone can see it. I assume you can. I have some slides I'm going to share with you now. And then we'll have lots of time, I hope, for some discussion. I'm eager to hear your opinions and questions and address them. Now, when I was preparing for this talk, I realized that there's a particular special challenge here. Now, my assumption is that some of you know quite a bit about the Chinese railroad workers. I've spoken at events before with Esther and William and General Chen, and so I know some of you are quite knowledgeable about this history. But then I realized that concluded that many are not. And then others are some in between and are curious to know what's been happening these past 2 years between the events of May 10th, 2019, which was the 150th anniversary of the completion of the railroad, and today, 2 years later. So I'm going to be talking about in some sense, those three elements. And I won't be going into a detailed history of the railroad, but we can talk about that in the chat, in the discussion afterwards, or you can take a look at some of the resources that we're providing. So I'm going to start here with a kind of, all right, with this slide, which is probably unexpected. Now, I would not recognize these dramatic photos here from last month when this immense ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. I mean, I cannot imagine how big this thing was until you look at the machinery over here and the anchor and you realize how mammoth this thing is. But in any case, the issue is it dramatized the importance of the Suez Canal, part of the great global infrastructure of trade, commerce, and international interaction these days. Now, many of you don't know, I think, that the Suez Canal was completed at almost the same time as the Transcontinental Railroad. The two were the most massive construction projects in human history, and they have endured in their importance. Before these infrastructures were completed, the world was a very different place. Now, this is a map. Many of you, or some might know, of the famous short story made into a movie by Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. And that was a fictional account of a man who made a wager in UK to go from here somewhere all around, to be able to get around the world in a blink of an eye in those days, 80 days. Today, of course, we can do it much faster. But 80 days was unheard of because of the transportation systems and the challenges of geography and distance. But Jules Verne realized that this vision of circumnavigating the world was available now to just about anybody who could afford it, because of two, when he read in the newspaper, when he was sitting at a Paris cafe, two events. One was the construction of the Suez Canal here, which made it possible for someone to go this route here and get to the Red Sea, cross Arabia, or he could have gone down here, gone to the sea route in here. Before the Suez Canal was done, one would usually go all the way up like that. The other event, which blocked a fast transit across the globe, was the New World, what you call so-called New World, particularly North America, immense 3,000 miles from the two coasts. There's much shorter distance here, of course, but there was no Panama Canal, and it took a much longer time to sail down this way to get here and then go all the way back up. And so when the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, Jules Verne realized that someone could make this trip much faster, easier, cheaper, and safer. For the Transcontinental Railroad, before it was completed, it would take 3-4 months, maybe longer, to get from one coast to the other coast. One would have to take a vessel from, say, New York Harbor down to Panama, get off a ship, walk across Panama Isthmus with malaria and other diseases rampant, wait for another ship to come up on the other side, take it all the way around. Another route was to go from New York or Boston, or go all the way down the tip of South America, Cape of Good Hope, and come all the way back up again, not getting off the vessel. The third route was to take a train. You could get out to Omaha, Nebraska, to about here, and then basically walk the rest of the way. Or take a horse. You were lucky, the horse would make it all the way. Many people died along the way. It was barren. It was unsettled territory. Native peoples were still fighting. And then you had the challenge of getting across the Sierra Nevada, which the unfortunate Donner Party didn't do in time before they got trapped by winter storm in the 1840s and descended into cannibalism. I mean, that was the kind of the three routes to get across the country. And even though California had been made part of the Union in 1850, it was still a long ways away from the centers of population in the Midwest or the East Coast or the South. And so the idea of the country as being a united nation was quite far off. It seemed a vision that had to be realized politically, because there was the division of the sectional division and also the geographic division. But the Transcontinental Road enabled new visions of this nation and of the world to come about. And this was the map here of what we call the Transcontinental Railroad was really, at that time, was called the Pacific Railroad. But it did become the linking with other railroads, the Transcontinental at the time, from Omaha, Nebraska, coming out this way, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, headed by Leland Stanford and the Big Four from Sacramento. There was a trunk line from Sacramento down to Oakland, going out here, and met out here near Salt Lake City or Promontory Summit in 1869. It was Abraham Lincoln signed the bill authorizing the construction of this and giving it federal subsidy in 1862. So it took 7 long years to complete this immense project. Now, the project ever since has been celebrated in American history in many different ways, usually a quite nationalistic, if you will, one that sort of portrayed in this symbol seen in this painting at the time, this illustration that foregrounds this engine here puffing away, full of passengers and freight, going to San Francisco, here in New York, San Francisco, you can see on the sign here. But all the other parts of this indicate the vision many Americans had of the significance of this railroad. Off to the side, unfortunately, you see native peoples. here on a bluff, smoke coming into their faces and being left behind. Out here is so-called unsettled territory, virgin lands, beautiful waterways and water resources, mountains and plains and beyond, so dream country, California. And along the way, the railroad brings about, quote unquote, say civilization, the public schoolhouse right here, children, families. You can see all the white population populating, taking down the forests, and here just some wagon trains setting out. There's long distance here, which will soon be eclipsed by the railroad. So, as a nationalist project, this Transcontinental Railroad probably has second to none, and this is also seen in this famous photo of me called Meeting of East and West, taken by A.J. Russell at Promontory Summit in May 10th, 1869, with the two engines from the two companies, representing the two companies coming head to head here, and depicting the physical completion of the railroad line. We have engineers, train engineers, and construction engineers shaking hands, and onlookers, all white men, looking. And this was perhaps, one of the most famous, if not the most famous photo from the 19th century. Maybe there's one of Abraham Lincoln that's more famous, but this is quite well known, circulate widely, and it is symbolizes the reunion of the country after the division of the Civil War, the physical distance being overcome, and this great engineering project built by quote unquote Americans coming to completion. But as many of you know, many Chinese Americans are upset with this photo because they ask, where are the Chinese workers? Where are they when they constituted 90% of the construction workforce on the Pacific or the Western side? Now, just to jump ahead a little bit, well, I think I might have mentioned, some of you have seen me speak before, there in fact is a Chinese worker in this famous photo, but he went undiscovered, unrecognized for more than 100, maybe 150 years, until, I would have to say, my wife and I, when we went to the California State Railroad Museum and we saw this photo enlarged many times over, and she looked at this, I said, can we see any Chinese in the, maybe mixed in the crowd somewhere in here? And she said, well, what about this guy right here? And I said, oh my goodness, I think you're right. He's different from all the others, as you can see. You can't see his face. He's got this floppy cotton hat on, tattered clothes. He's kind of stooped a bit here. He's not curious about the hoopla, about the photography, and he's a bit blurry because he's moving and everyone else is standing still. And I'm positive, I'm pretty sure that this fellow here is one of the railroad workers who lead the last track. Now, there may be others. There are other copies of this photo. And over here, there's a fellow who's cropped out, who may be Chinese. There may be somebody in here behind this hat. We're not quite sure why this guy has a hat on. He's trying to obscure somebody. We don't know. But this fellow here, I'm pretty sure, is a Chinese railroad worker. Now, the celebration of the railroad is also seen in artwork. This is a famous painting called Lane of the Last Track, which shows Leland Stanford, and he and the big wigs, the railroad barons who are all in here, are honored as the builders of the Transcontinental Railroad. They are presented in this painting in a legend that you can find with their numbers identifying the dignitaries here. Many of the people, including the women who are identified, two women here, except for these guys right here. Even this other guy on the ground is identified right here. But there's a big gap right here with these two guys unidentified, unnamed. And they're the Chinese railroad workers, as you can see. So instead of being the center of the project, which they worked and made it happen, they are relegated to a very minor role with no identity, and our eye is right here taken to Leland Stanford, who did preside over the events. Now, I must have missed a slide here. We know from other slides, though, taken by the same photographer as the previous one, of meeting of East and West, that the Chinese railroad workers did in fact lay the last rail. And they are depicted in another photo, much less well known, at the center of the photo, laying the last rail, and dressed similar to as the fellow in the other photo, and with the rail lines coming together. Now, this version of history is repeated on and on in books. Leland Stanford's biography, there are many biographies of him, and he's, again, the center of the great man of history writing, war governor of California. He was governor of California during the Civil War, railroad builder and founder of Stanford University, the Big Four. It's immortalized in the Golden Spike, which is here, which actually does exist. It's in the Stanford University Museum. This was presented at the events of May. Now, here's the slide. I got out of order. Well, you can see this photo taken moments before the other one shows these 2 or 3 Chinese, team of Chinese workers laying the last rail. And the composition of the photograph is taken by this artist, but the elements completely rearranged. So you can see these train engine over here. I'm not sure if this is in the way. I'm not sure what you can see, but this crowd here is the composition of this this photograph is duplicated by the artist, with the rail lines leading diagonally into the center here. But instead of leading it to see this fellow here, a Chinese rail worker, it leads us to see Leland Stanford. So you have the train engine here, the train engine here, telegraph poles, buckets on the ground, and so forth. And yet, this is the version of history that we receive, not this version of history. 50 years later, these fellows were brought out now in their 70s and 80s, and so were said to be part of the crew that laid the last track. So this history was only dimly understood, if at all. Many people did not know it. Many people did not know the history of the Chinese railroad workers and then the contributions they've made and the incredible importance of their sacrifice and labor for the Transcontinental route. Without them, the railroad line would not have been completed, certainly within the time allotted by Congress, but may have perhaps not even at all, given the extraordinary work they had to do, especially to get the line through the Sierra Nevada, the granite cliffs of the Sierra Nevada, and the dry, parching, burning deserts of Nevada and Utah. But the Chinese workers did it, some 20,000 workers over in total, and then maybe at any time 15,000. Then I can talk more about the actual work that they completed. Now, at the time, their accomplishments were acknowledged, if not celebrated, as you can see from this quote from the newly founded magazine, The Scientific American, where the magazine attributes the success, the completion of the railroad, to the Chinese. And he is honored as an issue, but he's an admirable railroad builder. You know, there's nothing more American than being a railroad builder. It's a very American identity. His temper is good, his disposition is docile. That is, I mean, he was worked hard, he didn't complain. His industry is unflagging, his strength and endurance are wonderful, and his mechanical skill is remarkable, which is interesting to note. His mechanical skill, he was not just a strong back and arms, but he had skills that helped complete, were necessary in the completion of this railroad. There are photos of the Chinese in the wintertime. You can see by their hats here, shoveling snow in the high Sierra. I had a friend who was in the high Sierra nearby, near this location. this past weekend. And he sent me, I should have downloaded it. He sent me a photo of this area. It's still covered with snow. Here it is early May. And the snow will be on the ground there until July. And this is the kind of conditions, the nice conditions during the summertime where they could work, although it's still got snow on the ground, it's muddy, but it's imposing terrain. Now, I can tell you more about what they did, what life was like with them, if you are interested later. I'm going to jump here to the 150th anniversary of the completion at Promontory Summit. With some of you, I was there. Maybe some of you on this webinar were there, and we can bring back certain memories. I think it's interesting to reflect on this past 2 years. What's happened since May 10th, 2019, and now 2 years later. Well, this is the Golden Spike National Historical Park, Promontory Summit, and the actual events took place, I guess, somewhere over here. I'm not sure exactly where it is. But I went out with others, and because this was a big event, 150th anniversary. But here you get some sense of the terrain. It's beautiful in that day, as you can see, but boy, is it desolate. It is in the middle of nowhere. This is a couple hours north of Salt Lake City. There's really nothing else around except sagebrush, dry ground, shrubs. But this is where those big celebrations were held that you saw in the photos. Now, the events occur regularly, but this was the big one, of course, the 150th. And much was made about it because there was a great deal of public sentiment that the events had become too celebratory of the bigwigs and not enough attention to the workers of all backgrounds, Irish immigrant workers, African Americans, Mormons, and Chinese. And there was a great deal of strong feeling that this was an injustice and had to be remedied. And to its credit, the committee that put on the anniversary celebration respected those sentiments and made a much more inclusive event and recognized in the presentations the diversity of all those of the people, the workers in particular, who made it possible. And hundreds, perhaps I'm not sure the exact number, I would say maybe 300-400 Chinese from all around the world. Some came from Hong Kong. You can see some donning hats to distinguish themselves here, came out to the event. And here it is, you see they're trying to recreate the meeting of those two locomotives. So you can see thousands, maybe 3,000-4,000 people who came here. There's a sound stage was here. And you see all sorts of people milling around, kind of Western feel to it. But I'd have to say, that the mood was quite good. It was welcoming, people were respectful, people were excited, and they all kind of sensed that this was an important anniversary to have. There were a number of speakers, mainly political people, who came up here. As you can see, another picture of the crowd. The Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, came up, was the most prominent Chinese American there. But Senator Romney was there, former governor of the state, and other prominent political figures came out, as well as many, you can see cultural groups, theatrical groups who came out to put on performances for the crowd. There was this sort of a historical reenactment of different events and speeches that were given. I'm not sure who he is. I know Leland Stanford is probably mixed into one of these fellows, but this was the kind of the reenactments. But also they brought out a group of Chinese Americans here who represented the crew that laid the last rail, as we talked about before. They were given quite a bit of a prominent position. So people had changed in their view that instead of writing the Chinese out of the history, they're now an integral part of the telling of that story. So there's a remarkable change that has been made as a result of the efforts of community groups, political figures, historians, RFR Project, and others to right the wrong of the neglect of the past. Now, one of the most prominent speakers was Connie Young Yu. Maybe some of you know Connie. She's a good friend of mine. She lives close by in Los Altos, near Palo Alto. And she is a community historian, longtime community historian who's done marvelous work. And she gave an eloquent speech talking about the achievements of the Chinese railroad workers and the injustice that had been of neglecting them in her history. Now, she had come out with her parents and the Chinese Historical Society of San Francisco at the 100th anniversary, 50 years earlier, to where the celebration event was entirely different. And she gave quite a moving description of the centennial celebration and how far we've come from the centennial to the I can never pronounce this, the 150th anniversary, and how insulted she, her parents, and others from the Chinese American community in San Francisco had come out, and they were promised some position in the program, but cut out in order to make way for a last-minute guest appearance by John Wayne. So she has some interesting sort of humorous stories to tell, but she spoke eloquently and movingly, and I think you can probably see her talk somewhere online. Now, you can see Romney there. I'm not sure where Elaine Chao is, but you can see here, someone else I want to recognize is Judge Michael Kwan, who was a local Utah state, I believe state judge, who founded the Chinese Railroad Descendants Organization, gathered scores of Chinese Americans who traced their ancestry back to the railroad workers, as he did himself. He worked tirelessly for promoting the history of Chinese railroad workers, helped sponsor a conference in Salt Lake City that was concurrent with the celebration, and helped bring me out to that event. Sadly, Judge Kwan died suddenly last year. He was able to be at the event to recognize his achievements, but he had a tragic death just a year ago, a little over a year ago. And another person who also tragically passed away during this time of COVID is the photographer Corky Lee, that you can see here next to me. And Corky and I had been all friends 50 years when we were young guys. And Corky had gone on and become maybe the most important community photographer of the Chinese community in the East Coast, New York in particular. His photos have become famous. And he became famous himself for coming out to Promontory Summit for more than, I don't know, a decade or 2 decades. Every year he'd come out to take photos of the anniversary celebration, to try to reimagine it. And then increasingly, under his encouragement, more and more Chinese Americans themselves would go out to Promontory Summit on the anniversary day and restage that famous meeting of East and West photo. And Corky would take the photo to now rewrite history or correct history and show Chinese in the frame. But unfortunately, tragically, last year he died of COVID. I'll just end here with some images of how I think how significant the work has been to bring the railroad story to the American public. And here I'm just speaking about some of the work that I've done. But I want to say that scores of people, many activists, including on this webinar, and who have been worked tirelessly to promote Chinese American history, to bring it to the attention of people, to get local organizations to pass legislation honoring the railroad workers. This is mainly around the 150th anniversary, but since then, the interest in the railroad workers has not diminished significantly. There's still a great deal of interest, and maybe even continuing as more and more people learn about it. I get calls all the time to speak about the railroad workers. And here are just some images I was able to share with you of some of the events that I've spoken with over the past couple of years. This beautiful photo over here, poster, was from Southern Methodist University, SMU, down in Dallas, Texas. They invited me out there, October 2019. And I'd never been to SMU and wasn't sure what I would discover, but they were enormously friendly and receptive and eager to learn. There were 350 people at the event, which I spoke, and many of them spoke very passionately about the importance of this history. And these were not just local Asian Americans. There were people of many different backgrounds. This here, I spoke just late 2020 at Brigham Young University out in Utah. Again, both two universities, one would not think of being very interested in diversity, but they really very much were. And there were 150 people on this Zoom, and very curious and eager to understand a more diverse and inclusive history. This was a screenshot of the advertisement for the event held at University of Michigan in 2019. And these are some of the major events. I've been speaking on podcasts and book talk, book club talks, and this. We have also, I always would like to point out that the work of the Railroad Workers Project still is available. You can see these on Stanford websites, and many people have. We put up one of our purposes of the project was to make some of our research material available. So we have here at this site reproductions of payroll records where people can look and see Chinese names on them and other material, documentary material that we have. We also sponsored an oral history project of descendants to talk about what the railroad has meant to them and what family lore there may have been. And Connie Young-Yu was one of the key leaders of this project, along with filmmaker Barry Fong, you can see here. These are just screenshots. This is our homepage. It's still up. You can go to it, and we update it occasionally, but the project now is not active, so we don't attend to all the events that continue to occur to keep the project going, news going. But you can go here and see some of the history of our project and some of the continuing resources that are available. This is the cover of one of the books that we produced. This is the cover of the book I'm proud of that it was published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which is a narrative history of the lived experience of Chinese railroad workers on the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is the other book. This is a scholarly volume of scholarly essays on the railroad workers. Now, just today, this has been released. They did this deliberately by the History Channel folks, but this is on Spotify. It's a podcast. The Chinese Immigrants Who Built America. This is quite impressive that they entitled this podcast "The Chinese Immigrants Who Built America," and this is for a national audience. And they basically they used me as a resource and as a reference, and so they interviewed me for this and also presented a pretty good history. I think it's only about 20-something minutes long, but it's really a well done job. They also have a link to another podcast I did down here. It's under, for some reason, political science, but I was interviewed about the book by someone else. So those are two resources you can use to get to hear the story in other forms. So that's the end of the show. Let me stop sharing here and open it up for discussion. Hi, Wilson.
Hi, Professor Gordon. We have a lot of questions for you today.
Wonderful.
And let me ask a few from the emails first. So the first question is, were there any findings of written words from the Chinese rail worker since these past couple of years? Because I know from your website, the railroad worker website, there was no, you guys do not have any written documentation.
Still no written documentation. It was very, very frustrating. We do have some words. It's interesting. You say the questioner asked about words. We have maybe 5 words, and they were written on one of the payroll records in Chinese. So the words, one of them is a signature that he's received his pay, and another line says something about receiving such amount of money for somebody else. So he had signed for it and he was going to deliver it to someone else. But it's interesting because the Chinese characters are written very nicely. They're Chinese script characters. They're written with a brush, and they have a vocabulary which we are told by scholars that the words were quite specific to those and would be used by someone who was familiar with accounting, Chinese accounting.
Wow. Interesting. Okay, another question. Is there research that supports dynamite work on the mountains, the Grand Mountain side, where Chinese rail workers were basically hanging down the mountain in these baskets?
Well,
Is that true? Or is that just a legend?
No, I went into the project knowing about this story, and it's I can give you a long account of it. It's really a fascinating journey I had. I went in wanting to believe it, and then the evidence was presented that persuaded me otherwise, cast doubt on it. And then I said, well, I still got to go figure this out myself. So I did a lot of research on this, a lot of work. And I came out finally at the end convinced that it did happen. Absolutely convinced. Absolutely convinced. So please take a look at the book. I won't give it, you got to go. If you know, I'm a little bit prideful here. I'm promoting the book, but I talk about that at some length in the book because it is such a controversial issue. It may not have happened where some people said it happened at a place called Horn, but there's too many accounts. We uncovered a number of contemporary accounts that describe the Chinese hanging down in baskets. And these were written by white travelers or journalists at the time in 1867, 1868.
Well, that's good to know. So what are new discoveries since your book, Ghosts of the Gold Mountain, published in 2019?
We don't have much new information. There's bits here and there. There was a book published in Canada, just released recently, that has reproduced excerpts from a diary of a Chinese Canadian. And he was a railroad worker on the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And there are a few entries, maybe half dozen very brief entries that are said to have been entered in his diary when he was working on the railroad line. But they don't really offer very much insight into his experience. We also continue to have efforts to locate material in China, but nothing significant yet.
Okay, so another question. I have heard people claim that it is a false narrative that Chinese rail workers were intentionally left out of the historical photo, and that it was merely a result of the unusual practice of documenting and celebrating projects, bigwig, example, bosses and bankers, instead of workers, regardless of whether they're Chinese or white. How will you respond to that? I think you touched on it a little, but maybe can elaborate a little more?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I understand why that criticism of the photo came about, but I think it's misplaced to say that they were intentionally left out of the photo. I looked at that as well, very carefully. There's no evidence to say that the photographer, A.J. Russell, who was a very good photographer and did document Chinese in many of his other photos. I showed you one other of them, and he wrote on the negative, the glass plate, Chinese laying the last rail. And there were other photographers who used that same gathering to take photos, but his photos became the most famous one. It's the best one. It's the most dramatic one. There were other photos around the time, and you can see Chinese wandering around. So they're present in the location, but for very different reasons, they just don't appear in the photo except for that one fellow. Now there are other speculations of why they don't, and but they from the eyewitness accounts of some of the journalists at the time, they said the Chinese were wandering around. They didn't seem to be very excited. They were just they didn't know it was just another day of work for them. So they weren't all hyped up like the rest of the crowd, and so that's consistent with them not being particularly eager to get in the photo and all that. And I'm sure that a lot of the other folks there, most of them were not workers. Those people in the photo were not workers. They're just gatherers. They came up from just gawkers. They may not have been very welcoming to the Chinese. That's, I would assume that would be the case too. But the other accounts, and there are quite a few accounts of that day, May 10th, 1869, and they're full of references to the Chinese and how they're walking around, and they were sort of on the side margin here, and they just did the work. They were there right after the conclusion of the events, and went, and along with everybody else, dove down to get souvenirs, parts of the ceremonial paraphernalia they took, and it was interesting. The Chinese kept them, but that's never handed down. And so I say, what happened to all those relics that the Chinese kept of that promontory point? No golden spike they had, but all their places were burned down, and I'm sure they lost a lot of his memorabilia as well. Now, we also know there were thousands of Chinese who brought the line up to that point, who worked very hard to get the line to Promontory Summit, including just a few week or 2 weeks before, the famous competition between the two lines to lay the track, and the Chinese laid 10 miles of track in one day, a phenomenal feat. So there were thousands of them right in the area. But as soon as that track was laid, and it was only a few 100 feet or so, maybe not even that long, to get to the meeting point, they were all sent, the thousands of them were sent back, because the railroad company still had lots of work to do, to finish the line, to improve the line, and so forth. So all those Chinese who were in the region were sent back towards California to work along other segments of the line.
Thank you. Was there any truth to the notion that the Mormons stopped many of the Chinese workers from coming into Utah at Wendover, Nevada? This may be why there weren't many Chinese in that historical photo.
I'm not sure that's, we can find evidence for that. There were not many Mormons on the Central Pacific Railroad, or if at all. They were working mainly on the eastern portion of Utah and the Union Pacific. And there were several hundred workers for the Union Pacific, and Brigham Young and the Mormons were very keen on trying to get the best deal for them from the Union Pacific. I found no evidence to show there was sustained contact between the Mormons and Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any proposal at Stanford University offering admissions or scholarships for Chinese descendants of railroad workers?
Well, and I think you froze there a bit. Well, so you said about scholarships for railroad workers of descendants. No, there's no such thing. Okay. Now where people are trying to get some plaque or statue or some memorial to recognize their importance to the wealth of Stanford, Leland Stanford. So I think that's in the works. So I think the university does acknowledge its indebtedness to Chinese at one level, but it still has a ways to go.
Did the Salt Lake City Chinese population have any role in increasing Chinese recognition events in Promontory?
Yes, they did. I mean, Michael Kahn was from Salt Lake City area, and there's a growing population in Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City is a growing city, place, and it's become notably more diverse. you know, it was very much of a Mormon city for many years, and the Mormons are still dominant in the city, but there were many other communities there, racial communities, immigrant communities, other identity communities. But the Chinese community is, I forget the name of the organizations that they have there now.
What do you know about the Northwestern Railroad and participation of the Chinese? Northern Western Railroad?
Well, there were, after the first transcontinental line was completed, there was a northern route. Maybe, I'm not sure if the questioner was asking about that. And there was also a southern transcontinental route that went from basically like from Los Angeles down through Arizona and so forth. The northern one went so there were three lines by the turn of this, at least three lines by the turn of the century. And Chinese worked on all three of them. And that there we just ran out of steam. We don't know much about their work and how many and what their conditions were, although we do know that they did work on them. There were also Japanese who worked on the northern line, and maybe even greater numbers than the Chinese. And that's a story that hasn't been really told much at all. The Chinese also worked on other lines from California up through to Washington and Oregon. They spread all across the country. This is a remarkable story where they go down to Arizona, Texas, Alabama, Tennessee, New Jersey, Long Island, Massachusetts. They were Chinese railroad workers all around the country in the 1870s and 1880s.
Thank you. Have you interviewed anyone living in China who is a descendant from a rail worker who worked in America? Is there a record of rail worker returning to China? Is there a record of rail workers returning to China?
Well, there's a great deal of mythology is too strong, I would say, but great deal of belief, connection of people in the counties where the railroad workers came from, about their connection to the railroad workers. In fact, many of the villages are called railroad villages. They still call them because so many of them left for railroad work, and the people who returned were the railroad workers. So now, do we have documentation recording? And, you know, no, we do. But they're just sort of hand to mouth that they were called railroad workers. They came back, and that connection was long-standing. And there were a few families who said, yes, definitely. My folks, my great-grandfathers were railroad workers. And a couple of, no one had any documentation, unfortunately, no written stuff. But some of them brought out interesting artifacts. And one of them was, it was said, it was a hammer, a kind of a very kind of heavy hammer used for construction. And it was said that the great-grandfather brought it back with him. He was a railroad worker. And he always carried it on his body because it was a useful tool, but it was also, he had it for his own self-defense. And then he brought it all the way back to China with him. So that's a great story, but you know, that's hand to mouth. I mean, just mouth to mouth from the family.
Thank you. How many Chinese workers died during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad?
Well, the railroad company did not keep good records. They didn't have what we would call a human resource department. But we thought a lot about this and tried to gather the different evidence, which was circumstantial. But it points to, I would say that about 1,200 Chinese died in the construction. And that's based upon some collection of newspaper articles that talk about accidents, some comparison with the Canadian Pacific Railroad, which was better documented. So they had something like one Chinese died for every mile or half mile of rail laid down. So, and then there was the quite compelling evidence in the newspapers of Chinese benevolent associations going out to collect the bones of Chinese along the route. And the newspaper accounts, several of them at the time, noted that this was quite a big endeavor. Many Chinese were involved. They hired railroad boxcars or cars for the remains. And this you can try to imagine the spectacle this was of them digging up the dead. And they brought back, it was estimated 20,000 pounds of remains to be shipped back to China for final burial in home villages. So from that 20,000, that's how people estimate it was 1,200.
I see.
And the pastor who oversaw the event and who gave the benediction at Promontory Summit that day was quite friendly to the Chinese. And he mentions in his book that he uses the figure of 1,200.
Did anyone request reparations for families who lost relatives during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad?
Perhaps, I don't know. They certainly were very much exploited, some mistreated, but they were also, by and large, voluntary. That is, they hired on. They were not slaves. They were not forced to work. So it's a different circumstance than, say, the slavery.
Thanks for the answer. Thank you for your previous answer. How many oral history have been donated, and are they transcribable?
Yes, the number I forgot now, because that has slowly increased over the years, and maybe around 20 now families that we have. They're really very interesting, and you can go on to the websites, go to the and they're all available through the Stanford Library and through our website. And we have I think we have transcripts as well as video of the audio video of the interviews. They're very well done.
What is your take on actually it's a mini series, Hell on Wheels? Does it cast the Chinese in a positive way? I'm not sure if you saw that.
Well, I more than saw that. I was a consultant to it.
Okay.
They hired me to advise them.
Wow.
The script.
Wow.
So I was not involved in production, but they did want some authenticity. So before filming began, they shared the script with me. And I even went out to the production site.
Wow.
It was a fun experience. So that, they were in entertainment. I'd say that what they presented was pretty good. Not to say that I made much of it. I mean, I made some difference, but this was on their own. I mean, they've read the book, they read the material, and they put together a story. I thought it was a little far-fetched to have a female character who was, masquerading as a boy or a young man, and all that business and the romance. I mean, that was Hollywood stuff. And I told them I didn't care for it. But I'll give you a couple of little fun stories. If you know that the good labor contractor who gets killed, the father of the his name is Fong, F-O-N-G. On my mother's side, I'm a Fong, F-O-N-G. And the bad guy, the Chinese, who's the pimp and drug dealer and the labor contractor who's the bad, his name is Chang, C-H-A-N-G. So one of the things we had was to talk about names, because they found these really hokey names. I said, how about these other names, Lee or, something that was more Cantonese. And so Fong and so I'm sort of embedded in that.
Oh boy. I'm glad you didn't give the bad person the last name of Lee, and then all the Lees would be looked at as pimps and bad guys. So thank you for not suggesting Lee to them. Thank you. Okay. So how long did it take to get through the Summit Tunnel? I guess the question is, how long did it take for the Chinese workers to dig through the Summit Tunnel?
Yeah. That's in the book too. I mean, that was an extraordinary feat. It took 2 years, almost constant work through 2 years, including through the winters. And I can't imagine working in the guts of a mountain in the wintertime up there. It'd be like working in a walk-in freezer, it would seem to me.
Are there any next steps with this railroad education, or what would you like to see happen in your lifetime?
Well, I like to see the story disseminated much more. We have a curriculum project ongoing. Is also connected with Stanford, and so that story is getting it out into the K through 12 schools in California. But that's available; it's free for teachers if they want. They can go to what's called SPICE, Stanford Program in Intercultural Education, or something like that, and they have a lesson plan on the railroad workers.
Thank you.
So that's what I like to see, just the story more, get out more. And I really, it's been, people talk about the Chinese railroad workers all the time now, particularly around this month, Heritage Month, and a number of people have mentioned the railroad workers, which they didn't before.
How many of the Chinese railroad workers were married?
Hard to say, I think some were, probably most weren't. Most of them were pretty young men from mid-teens, as young as 15 or 16 to probably late 20s. Also the prime working years, they'd be able to endure that tough life. And so some of them were married in China, or they were married when they left China, or some of them were married in absentia. That is to say, their parents married them to somebody so that try to obligate them to return home. My grandfather came from those home villages. He was not a railroad worker, but he left as a young man, late teens. He came to the United States, and when he was gone, his parents married him to a chicken.
Oh my
I mean,
goodness.
no, I'm sorry, not to a woman.
Oh.
And they substituted, some of you may know this was the custom. They brought a rooster representing him to marry the unfortunate woman.
Oh boy.
And so that was the marriage.
I hope she doesn't eat the rooster, but What
So
is the
maybe-
name? What is the name of the pastor who gave the benediction for the Chinese workers' balls?
A good question. I can't recall. I'm gonna write now. It's
Maybe
in the
you
book.
can find out, and then we can.
Yeah, it's in the book somewhere. It's in the book.
Please buy the book. Please buy the book, okay,
Yeah.
guys. There was a strike by Chinese rail workers who stopped work, but they were deprived of food and forced back to work. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, that's a remarkable story. Where in 1867, 3,000 railroad workers went on strike, the Chinese, and how they organized, how they communicated with each other, because they worked and lived miles along the track. We don't know. And they had leaders. They were well organized, disciplined. It was the biggest labor action in American history to that point, and long afterwards. And yet, in American labor history books, you don't see any mention of it. So I'm very keen on getting that recognized for many reasons. One, it was an accomplishment in itself, but it also speaks to this long-standing stereotype of Chinese as being docile or compliant or weak or something like that, not active. And that strike just speaks against that. But even though they weren't successful in all the ways, after a week of striking way up in the Sierra, conditions did improve for them. Again, check out the book.
We're gonna make sure you people know how to buy the book later, okay? Weren't some Chinese workers kept on to maintain the tracks at depots along the route after the completion of the railroad? Why didn't Chinese take on other railroad jobs, such as the way the black Pullman or car porters, or maybe as cooks or cleaners for the trains, basically?
No, they were. I mean, so as I mentioned, the Chinese will continue to work all around the country, and we've documented that. That's particularly in the book, The Chinese on the Iron Road. So you can see some of the different lines in which they worked, and they did. So they worked on the Union Pacific lines as maintenance people, and we went back and looked at the newsletter, the company newsletter. And they recognized the China, long-standing. This fellow worked for 50 years for the union, but they were line keepers all around, but they were just sort of faded back into history. So maybe we can go, I see maybe three, we can do some quickly here.
Okay.
Is there any collections? No, no artwork, no Chinese foremen speak English. Many of them did. I mean, they were the go-betweens. And the Chinese they were foremen, but also labor contractors. So a lot of the Chinese actually worked for Chinese who were the labor contractors, and the contractors were the intermediary between the workers, not just in a supervisory way, but as in a business way with the company. You know, they were the contractors. So and I think an important thing, which I like to point out, is the Chinese there were a lot of different Chinese. There were Chinese who were uneducated, who were laborers. There were some who were skilled. They were masons, carpenters. They knew how to use explosives, which were very dangerous at the time. Some of them were literate. Some spoke English. Some were cooks. Some were doctors or medicine people that tended to the people. Some were gamblers who just hung along with the workers and sold opium and all that business. So what happens to them afterwards? They go aft to all the towns where the railroad allows them to go, and they open up stores. They did merchandising. They opened up restaurants because they were now cooks. They were business folks of different sorts, merchants. They were doctors. So the railroad really was the origin of a lot of Chinese American stories.
Thank you. Can you share any of the educational program link in this chat? Do you think there will be a reunion for descendants of the railroad workers for the 155th anniversary?
Well, maybe. Maybe. It'll be nice to see. I think we've come to the end of our time, though, Wilson. I got to run.
If you can, okay.
I appreciate all the interest.
Thank you. If you can share with some link, maybe we can put it on our website so the guests can participate. Thank you so much, Professor Gordon. Can you please tell our audience where they can purchase your two books and what's the best way for them to purchase the books, the two one that?
Well, as with everything else these days, everything can be purchased through Amazon. But so the Amazon books, so you know the books there, the price is okay, but they still got they got them there.
Thank you. So if the audience wants to have your autographed book, I guess they would have to purchase the book, send it to you, and then you send it back to them, right? Basically.
Something like that, or you know, what people actually do, and it is difficult to communicate these days because I don't go to my office at Stanford. So if people send me letters there, I won't get them for some time. But sometimes people just send a book plate or a little sticky, and I can sign it and they can put it into their book.
Maybe I should just buy 100 books, go to your house, have you sign it on, and bring it back to Boston, and I'll charge a premium and make a little money on it, you know.
Okay, we can do that too. You're
Thank you, Professor Gordon. God bless you. Thank you for your presentation.
My pleasure. Good luck to
Have a
you
great
all.
night.
Stay safe.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
All right, attendees, thank you so much for coming. And I do want to make a couple of announcements. So there was a question by Lisa Chow about the 150th anniversary. Yes. So the Chinese Rail Worker Descendant Association just elected a new president, and the president is Karen Kwan. So for those of you who know Karen or Michael, so Karen actually is Michael's sister. Karen is the first Chinese Asian American to be elected to the Utah State Representative. So Karen will be the new president. And I guess I can tell you, I was also elected as a board member of the Chinese Rail Worker Descendant. My great-great-grandfather was a worker. So we are actually organizing events to celebrate the 155th in both Washington, D.C. and Salt Lake City on Friday, May 10th, 2024. So if you please check on the website. In another 2 years, we'll have the most current up-to-date information. Yes, we are planning a major celebration in 2024. Thank you. And please tune in tomorrow for our next webinar, which is also at 8 o'clock. Also 8 o'clock. So tomorrow's actually webinar is really good. It features David Lay. He's going to talk about the legal cases that the Chinese community brought against California and into the U.S. Supreme Court, because as many of you know, because of the 1882 Chinese exclusion law, Chinese were not allowed to become citizens, which means that they weren't allowed to vote. So basically, the only cause of action available for the Chinese population, Chinese community at the time, was through legal action. So please join us tomorrow. I think you're going to find David's talk incredibly rewarding, and you'll definitely learn a lot. Thank you so much, everyone. God bless you all, and happy 152nd anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. And for all you descendants out there, we all should be really, really proud of our ancestors. This really was an incredible contribution. And there's no question that without the Chinese worker, the Transcontinental Railroad would never have been finished, at least not that fast. Thank you, guys. Have a good night. Love you guys. You guys are the best.